I invite the next presenter, Ms. Giuliana Oyola Lozada, who is from the University of Queensland, Australia.
Well, let me start by acknowledging this invitation to present our perspective from what should be a possible regulatory science agenda for some Latin American countries. In this case, I will be presenting 4 countries which are so-called Pacific Alliance countries. And this is part of my, my research at the University of Queensland. So I would like to start by explaining what the Pacific Alliance is. And this is a recent initiative. It's practically new. And it started in 2011 with the Declaration of Lima. And it is formed by 4 countries, which are also called the Pacific Pumas, because Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and Chile, they have some of the most strongest economy in the region. And they also constitute a big market, and we have all together we are about the 8th economy in the world. So this agreement is not only about trade and commerce, but also about deep integration in key and strategic topics. For example, one of the topics that it's addressed is the regulatory cooperation, because it's considered very strategic to ensure commerce, to ensure trade. And it's also addressed as a barrier if there is no harmonization in the region. So one of the most important milestones was in 2013, in which the 4 national regulatory authorities or drug regulatory authorities signed an agreement for cooperation in strategic in regulation of pharmaceuticals. So we were concerned, or we are, as a part of this strategy or as part of the regulatory chapter, the Pacific Alliance members are looking for new fields, new opportunities to work in the convergence of the region. So we observe that health is an important issue, and especially the development of pharmaceuticals, because many of our, or all of the 4 members are working in different policies to stimulate and to boost innovation and to have local innovation. So we are an important market for clinical trials, for drug development, and we are also, let's say, we have now more advances in science and technology that enables also to generate innovations from our countries. So as you may know, this graphic is basically the process to develop a drug. It's a very long process which has very stages, and across all of them, regulatory oversight is a very important one. Because to ensure that a drug has a correct quality, safety, and efficacy, it needs to compel or it needs to fulfill certain regulatory requirements. So our question was, to what extent are our countries prepared, or are the regulation of our countries ready to receive this new wave of innovation? To what extent the PI countries are equipped for an efficient regulation of new vaccine products under clinical trial applications? So we were, how we approach this issue is we are try to identify what are future areas of cooperation, and we have evaluated regulatory frameworks of the 4 countries, and to detect what are the possible areas of cooperation. And for this, the technique or the methodology that we have followed is doing a content analysis, which is a very interesting tool to analyze regulatory documents, a big data set, large data sets. So we basically selected regulatory documents for new drugs, for the development of new drugs. And, well, here it's not very clear, but basically we are able to compare what are the main concepts, the main themes in regulatory documents, what are the gaps, what are the emerging concepts, and for example, here we have, my apologies that it's not very clear, but for example, we have the outputs of our analysis allow us to generate this type of concept clouds, and those dots that you see with words are basically the important topics, and they are clustered around other important topics, let's say. And we also get tables like this that allow us to see how every country approach to strategic topics. For example, good clinical practices, good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practices, and it's we can quantify the differences among each regulatory system. So, well, after doing this analysis, we have identified 4 areas that need or are possible to be or need to be addressed in the future. And well, the first one is that we corroborate that our systems are well equipped in terms of regulation, and we fulfill with international standards established by WHO or ICH. We have regulations prepared for good quality, good clinical practices, for example. But we have observed also that there are gaps. And in this case, one of the most important is regarding to quality issues. It's one of the areas, and when we see in the graphics in the table like this on the left, yes, on the left, you will see low scores in certain thematic areas that we choose, and one of those is, of course, regarding to quality matters. So it's a topic that can be addressed in the future for Pacific Alliance countries. Then, the challenge is to develop and implement regulations that allow flexibility for new technologies. We need to be to be prepared. As I said before, now we have nanotechnology, we have monoclonal antibodies, biosimilars. So this is an enormous opportunity to join together and deploy a force to regulate these areas. Even before we are recently starting with these new developments. And the other thing that we observed was marked differences in requirements and procedures. So regulatory divergence. So even though we have let's say that the baseline in regards of regulations to ensure quality, we still have we are not harmonized. We have not harmonized our procedures. So this can lead to what is called by literature as regulatory dissonance, which means that even sponsors present the same kind of scientific information, the regulatory opinions are going to vary depending on the country, because there are not standardized procedures. There are not procedures to do a joint review of applications for clinical trials, for example, or for evaluation of ethics protocols, and so on. So this is also an opportunity that as a region we need to address. It's not only about creating harmonized rules on a paper, let's say, but also to harmonize our regulatory practices. And then the fourth observation is that we need to reinforce coordination in the governance and oversight of clinical trials. So we don't have a system such as, for example, the EMI, with a centralized regulatory agency. Every country has their own drug regulatory authority, which, of course, sometimes can be a burden, and sometimes can be confusing even for local or for foreign projects that are willing to conduct studies in our region. So what is a potential contribution towards South-South cooperation? So, well, One of the strategic goals it's number 3, support the development, the research and development of vaccines and medicines. So we are sure that regulation here it's have a very critical. It takes a very critical place here to promote, to help promoting, help boosting innovation, help boosting, strengthening our innovation system. So we think that the region, that a specific alliance, should focus on regulatory convergence, not only in the registration on drugs, but even in the earliest stages in drug development. And we need to work together to prepare new and novel mechanisms for regulatory convergence, which implies, of course, the harmonization of regulatory documents, but also, as I was saying, of standards, guidance, procedures, and different mechanisms that will allow us to streamline development of novel vaccines for the unmet needs that are still prevalent in our region. So with this, I would like to thanks again for your attention, and we can discuss any question at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next presenter whom I'll invite is Mr. Daniel Ricardo Perez Valerino from Biopharma Holding, Havana.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Balakrishnan, for the introduction. It's a big pleasure for me to be here in this conference. All my gratitude to Professor Chaturbedi and his valuable team at RIS. I would like to share with you the research that I have been conducted in the last 10 years, thanks to the support of a group of colleagues from Cuba and other countries in the world. This paper was presented in January 2018 during my participation in the IT course on science diplomacy here in New Delhi. So I will try to review in some slides this presentation in order to share with you the results. So the title of this presentation is South-South and Triangular Cooperation on Science and Health Following Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba as Case Study. As you may know, in the last 10-15 years, we have seen a very complex situation in our planet, because several diseases that in any moment of the life were solved due to the use of vaccines and biopharmaceutical products, some of those diseases are emerging, not only in developing countries, also in developed countries in Europe, US, Canada, Japan. You can see that very recently there are an outbreak of measles in Europe. But also it's a big problem because you can see that there are many diseases preventable using vaccines in many countries: cholera, Ebola, typhoid fever. There is a very complex situation in terms of health. So this is a big problem. This is an issue that the scientific community, the politicians, and many people must to do something regarding this situation, because we are trying to invest in order to apply the global goals to 2030. And health is a human right that we must to take in consideration in order to raise the health conditions for humankind. So there are many answers to the question why this is happening. We could organize a congress only to explain why this situation is occurring in the last 10, 15 years, and mainly in the last 5 years. But this research don't have as main goal to explain why this is occurring. There are many answers: the anti-vaccine movement, the poverty, the difference in the development between the different countries and the regions worldwide, the situation with the medicaments, that is a big problem. Also the production of the medicaments in basically in all the countries. Only a few group of countries have the capacity to produce vaccines and biopharmaceutical products. So what we going to try to do is to explain what we must do in order to solve the situation, and I will to explain a case study, trying to open some minds and trying to share with you how could be possible that in a few years we could solve this situation. So if in some countries and regions, mainly on developing countries, it seems that will persist pandemics that threaten to disperse death and poverty, and if appropriate measures are not taken with political will and granted needed financial support, then what we must do? This is part of the solution, but in fact, we consider that South-South and triangular cooperation with a special focus on SDG accomplishment must contribute on follow-up practical solutions against this complex situation. Today in the morning, we share some point of views that explain how could be possible that the scientific community, the politicians, the investors could work together in a joint collaboration in order to find new ways, new alliances to produce innovative vaccines, innovative biopharmaceutical products, to try to find new solutions. So the implementation by governments and international organizations of science and health diplomacy as a tool in this scenario has proved to be useful despite the complexity of its practical execution through international negotiations and multilateral agreements. This is a complex movement because demand people with high skills in order to negotiate, in order to talk, in order to convince key people for working in that way for finding new solutions. It's about finding a balance between public health as science plus scientific development with the art of diplomacy. Using this balance, people could arrive to an important scenario where the politicians could understand that we need to do something, that we need to find innovative solutions in order to create the possibility of raising new health conditions for the humankind. In the case of Cuba, it's the case that I need to explain because it's the case that I know since many years ago due to my job. You need to know that we are talking about a group of over around 1,000 islands with around 110,000 square kilometer meters in area and around 11.5 million of inhabitants, that today has around 70,000 doctors, around 90,000 nurses, and around 30,000 technicians in hospitals, polyclinics, etc. And also, is a country that today has one of the most prestigious and recognized pharmaceutical industries among developing countries. Today, this is a reality because since the 60s and the 70s, the government decided to do a very important investment in health and science development, in the educational system, in the health system, and the scientific development. Thanks to this investment, many medical doctors, chemistry, engineers, physicians, etc., began to work in a very important multidisciplinary teams in some institutions in order to create the conditions to mix, to join the capacity of the universities with the capacity of the research and development, the commercialization of these products, the production capacity, and the registration of several vaccines and biopharmaceutical products, and some of them in collaboration with international groups worldwide. At the same time, as I said before, this is a case study very interesting, because we are talking about two ways that in some moment conflude in one way. In one side, we have the medical treatment, the capacity of creating a group of human resource, as I said before, thousands and thousands of medical doctors with high skills, with the knowledge necessary to share treatment in the country and also in many countries in the world. Around more than 400,000 health specialists in more than 160 countries and nations have been working in America, in African countries, Asian countries, and inclusive in some European countries. Those people, those specialists have been working since 1963 in those countries, not only under the pressure of a situation like a earthquake, a flood, or something like this. Also, they have been working there under programs of collaboration, supported sometimes with the help of international organizations, trying to create new conditions of life in those countries. You can see there some examples in Mexico, in Peru, Gambia, Haiti, Angola, Indonesia, China, Pakistan, etc. There are many examples that I could share with you about the participation of Cuban medical brigades in those countries. And it's not only the participation of the medical doctors, it's also the investment in the human resource in those countries in order to prepare medical doctors with the programs of study of the Cuban universities. And in that case, I could mention, for example, the Latin American School of Medicine based in Havana, but also has some faculties in African countries and Latin American countries. All those students, when they degree, they have the knowledge, they have the capacity to express, to share their knowledge, and to give a treatment to people that needs help, that needs support. At the same time, on the other hand, I am talking about the other side, the biopharmaceutical industry. A biopharmaceutical industry that began at the end of the 70s and was developing a way in order to register innovative products. The first one was at the end of the 18th decade, in the last century. The first one was the meningococcal vaccine against serogroup B and C. At that time was the unique vaccine against the serogroup B. It was a vaccine that had a very positive impact in Cuba, in Brazil, in Argentina, in different countries. And thanks to the economical results of this vaccine, the Cuban government had the possibility to invest in other institutions, in other projects. And you could see in the graphic that between 1991 and 2000, Other products were registered, most of them very innovative products, and in the last decade, more products were registered, products that are unique in the world. For example, the Heberprot P, which is a formulation against the diabetes food. It's a product that has a very high capacity to use it in the people that have problems, ulcers in their feet, and has more than 70% of probability that could not be necessary to cut the feet of the patient. So all those products have been commercialized in more than 60 countries, and taking into account that in some moment of the life this was an organization that could be very important for the economy of the country, the government decided to create in 2012 BioCuba Pharma, which is a big holding with around 32 companies and more than 22,000 people, all of them engaged on the program to produce and to commercialize all these vaccines and biopharmaceutical products, not only for the Cuban people, also for more than 60 countries worldwide. I would like to share with you this example. With this example, I guess that it's very easy to understand the philosophy and the decision that the people in Cuba did in the last 10 years in order to create the conditions for a best collaboration, a South-South collaboration using health and science diplomacy. In 2006, in a region of Africa, a region that the scientists and the epidemiologists knowing as the meningitis belt of Africa, is a region that goes since Senegal till Ethiopia and Eritrea. There is in this region yearly they have an outbreak of meningitis, and in 2006 even that the scientific community and the big pharma had a very good vaccine, a polysaccharide vaccine. Suddenly the biopharmaceutical industry decided to stop the production of this vaccine because they decided to use the facilities where they produced until this moment this vaccine to produce other vaccines, in this case not polysaccharide vaccine, conjugated vaccines, which are most expensive, but those vaccines are better for developed countries. Then it was a very complex situation because suddenly UNICEF and the World Health Organization had a lack of vaccines. And the vaccines that were ongoing on development, for example, here in India, Serum Institute had a very good vaccine, but at that time was not ready. The vaccine will be ready in 2010, 2011. So what happened? What will happen between 2007 and 2010 or 11? Many people could die due to this situation. So the World Health Organization did a call to all the producers of vaccines in order to find a solution. Cuba and Brazil did a joint collaboration, Biomanguinhos in Rio de Janeiro and Finlay Vaccine Institute, in order to work together to produce in Cuba the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and then the active pharmaceutical ingredients we supply to Biomanguinhos. Biomanguinhos finish the production of the vaccine, and then we send together the vaccine to UNICEF, and UNICEF supply the vaccine to the different countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. That was a very interesting idea because it was recognized by United Nations. That was the first time in the history that two developing countries joined strengths in order to work together for supporting other developing countries with a biopharmaceutical product. It was necessary to do a fast-track program because, of course, we need to demonstrate that this production was under GMP conditions, and immediately, in 6 months, we received the approval, and immediately thousands and thousands of vaccines were delivered in African countries, and thanks to God, it was a very important solution. This is an example that I think that could show to you how to work in that way. So as conclusion, we could say that health diplomacy and science diplomacy are tools which, in theory, trying to achieve an agreement between the countries to raise awareness by health policies in order to achieve better results in those countries with fewer incomes. That's why the role of governments are essential, but also the role of NGOs, the biopharmaceutical industry, the regulatory agencies, and the educational system of the countries. From the way that all these actors could be sensitized and act together will depend the success of this program. On the other hand, the example of Cuba have shown how far a country with few economic resources can carry out actions of solidarity, cooperation, and scientific exchange to raise its international relations and collaboration with countries of the world while helping health thereof. Regardless, it's not a perfect model, has achieved incredible success, improving the life of many people of this planet through the practice of science diplomacy and health diplomacy. I would like to finish with this statement. It is a statement from, that was stated by Fidel Castro some years ago. To dream the impossible, it's usually called utopia. To fight not only for achievable hours, but also essentials to the survival of humankind, must be called realities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was indeed a very rich and inspiring presentation. We now will proceed to a discussion, and I'll ask the first discussant, Dr. Maria Noel Dusort from the National Scientific and Technical Research Council of Argentina. Would you like to start?
Thank you, Ambassador. If Mr. Ambassador doesn't mind, I'm going to remain here. Well, first of all, I would like to thank RIS for the invitation to be part of Delhi Process 5. I am honored to be here exchanging different perspectives about South-South cooperation. I am going to start with general ideas about the topic of this panel to continue giving some feedback of your analysis. South-South cooperation has changed a lot since the Buenos Aires Plan of Action in 1978. It is necessary to reflect these changes within its narrative to strengthen its position at the international level. In this sense, some countries have included South-South trade as part of their South-South cooperation definition since the beginning of the 21st century. Indeed, the final declaration of BAPA Plus 40 states, and I'm quoting, the important role of trade to generate growth and also economic development in the Global South. Within this narrative, we need to remember that some countries, some developing countries, like the country where I'm from, Argentina, insert themselves into the world trade as producers of raw materials. This type of insertion causes damage in the balance of payment in the long term due to, as Raúl Prebisch, an Argentinian politician and scholar, point out, the theory of deteriorating terms of trade. In this context, developing countries are incapable of reaching development because they do not have the structural internal conditions to achieve industrialization. It is true that some developing countries have beneficiated from the recent cycle of high international prices of commodities, but its insertion in international trade as producer of raw materials have demonstrated some intensification of a re-primarization process. In this regard, some emerging powers have applied trade benefits to developing countries, such as debt relief, trade loans, duty-free trade preferences, or line of credits, which they include in the concept of South-South cooperation. Considering this, trade benefits are in the short term and do not resolve the main problem, which is the type of international insertion. So, can we continue to include trade benefits as South-South cooperation actions? Instead, their purpose is not developmental, but the advancement of trade and investment opportunities. If South-South cooperation is changing its historical core from political to economical, reflecting some current practices led by emerging powers, it is time to question the way we define it. Otherwise, the concept could become anachronistic. Even more, most of the time, the funds delivered by powerful countries from the South to least developed partners, as trade promotion or development finance, are under some conditions. In other words, the funds are not free of having some rules like a fixed share of national products, machineries, and the acceptance of migrant workers. Therefore, it is coherent to maintain the absence of conditions when we consider South-South trade as a part of South-South cooperation. Nevertheless, there are some examples in the past years in which we can find some sort of agreement between different countries of the Global South regarding South-South cooperation. As Maria Eugenia Pereira has pointed out, it was the case of G20 grouping on agriculture issues in the WTO. The sharing of the same objective, which was a progressive liberalization of the agricultural sector, was crucial. The success of this coalition building, considering one specific topic, agriculture, must encourage our countries to have more initiatives like this in other areas. Pharmaceutical patents are another example in which we can find a certain agreement between some big emerging countries like Brazil, South Africa, and India to defend production of generic medicine on their industries, as we heard this morning in one of the panels. Another coalition building to defend South-South trade. Taking into account my concerns about South-South trade under the framework of South-South cooperation, we have to recognize that technical and scientific cooperation are indicators of development cooperation with lesser questioning. In this view, capacity building is the best way of what our developing nations have to share useful knowledge and practices to other partners in the same level of development. Capacity building focuses on understanding the obstacles that inhibit people, governments, international and non-governmental organizations from realizing their developmental goals. At the same time, it enhances the abilities that will allow them to achieve measurable and sustainable results. It is a promotion of skills and competencies in individual and in the partner organization that encourages and tries to sustain autonomy. Capacity building enables us to identify and prioritize our needs in order to master more effectively development tasks. As a conclusion, we can affirm that South-South trade has generated growth in terms of GDP, but it does not necessarily involve development. Our history has shown that the path to development is to add value to the goods we can produce. Or instead, we can share our technology advances in order to generate new processes and services that could make the difference. Considering the papers we have, the papers we have heard this afternoon, I would like to point out that the paper of Kenneth, Maria Eugenia, and Jean-Claude highlighted the importance of strengthening interregional trade in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, and to a certain extent reinforce or look for common interests in order to negotiate in a better position with some emerging powers such as India and China. This is very important because they are countries of the same level of development, and South-South trade has more pros than cons. In the case of Daniela, Juliana, and David, their purpose focused on capacity building and technology transfer in the health sector and renewable energy sector. And I have some questions that we could discuss later. I would like to know more about, for instance, the patents or intellectual property issue considering Cuban pharmaceutical industry. Also, we could apply to the Pacific Alliance countries. Because maybe you have the financing and the knowledge, but without a patent, the vaccine or the medicine is, in a certain extent, out of the Western health system. It's not recognized in the Western health system. So I would like to know more about what you have researched about that. And in the case of Daniela, considering the case you have analyzed Seychelles, I would like to know more about how has the country accomplished the projects you have mentioned? From where is coming the financing to implement those renewable energy policies? Or how about the technology? It's national technology, it's foreign technology. Which countries are Seychelles partners to implement renewable energy policies? Thank you.
Thank you. I now turn the floor over to the second discussant, Mr. Pranay Sinha, who's from RIS.
Thank you, Chair. So as Chair told you that I belong to RIS, so please forgive me for my institutional bias in the lens through which I have seen the presentation this evening. I would like to take us to revisit the 5 components of Development Compact, which we have been discussing for last 2 days, to just see what kind of components which have appeared in the presentations. So as we have seen, the capacity building, trade, grants, technology, and concessional finance are the 5 pillars of development finance. And to revisit, these modalities are not necessarily exclusive in nature when we are interacting in the South-South cooperation mode. It could be multimodality as well. So, so with this thing or this bias back in our mind to see what we have seen through these case studies, let us visit what happened in the first case study. I'm going to trace this, navigate these 5 modalities with my lens, with this Development Compact lens, and see what was appearing to me, definitely. In the first presentation, Mr. Ekuecha was talking about regional integration. And in one of the slides or in the presentation, she mentioned that the building of regional infrastructure is the way ahead. And she gave 2 examples, the Ethiopian-Djibouti railway line and the joint industrial park and economic zones. So my question and my query was there that which modality could be used if it has been used, or which modality could probably be used in the coming days if it has not been used so far, if you could see within the 5 dimensions. Is it concessional finance for the Ethiopian-Djibouti rail line, or is it something grant or capacity building at what level of institutional? So maybe we could see if we could get a response from her. The second presentation from Ms. Martinez. It was more on trade part from a dimensional perspective, agreeing on the tariff barriers and establishing trade agreements. We saw Mercosur and then Chile and Peru agreement over a period of time. And the areas of and the areas was to enhance South-South cooperation through trade. Once again, I was reminded that what kind of instruments? Is it duty-free, quota-free kind of arrangements? And probably that was the case here, that duty-free, quota-free trade arrangements were identified as a modality. Now, I'm not going into whether it was beneficial, how much beneficial to whom, was it mutually beneficial or not at all? Those are the questions which I'll take later. The third presentation from Ms. Smith for the IORA International IORA Forum. She mentioned that following on ministerial forums and ISA General Assembly, there was a need for more investments, and the organization itself, the collective of all the member nations itself is an expression of solidarity. But at the same time, what kind of modalities as an organization one is looking forward to? The technology transfer, innovations, yes, but capacity building, yes. Partnership with bilateral partnership with countries, and then establishing a relationship with multilateral bodies. So I would be interested to see how she sees in the days ahead with those development compact pillars. Then Mr. Jean, the fourth presenter from University of Burundi, I saw this as the first time that it was not falling in any of those categories very explicitly. The technology transfer and identifying capacity building as a challenge, and then saying a way forward that policy formulation, technology diplomacy, further regulation matters. I think the capacity building of the institutions is not much talked about in the South-South cooperation realm. Capacity building in terms of sending scholars or capacity building of training like ITEC program has always been talked about, but at the same time in terms of bringing this technology matter in terms of policy convergence was never in our mind, that capacity building of institutions, how it actually shapes up. Then as we have gone for the fifth presentation from Ms. Lozada, the Pacific Alliance. This was once again the regulatory compliance and convergence. I don't know whether any modality except the capacity building or convergence of institutions, how this has actually happened. But then standardization of the country's institution to take care of future challenges, and then probably producing a comparable and internationally recognized standards within the domestic constituency. This is once again not much talked about in the South-South cooperation, and using this for conformity assessment, technical regulation procedures, and further these conditions to overcome the barriers to trade. This is one of the best examples I have seen in terms of trade, how to demonstrate these kind of cooperations in terms of case studies. And finally, the case study from our Cuban colleague, Mr. Valerino. One thing which was pretty demonstrative in his presentation, that he had provided a long history of his own country's domestic health system, the strength of the health system, and then what they have done in their own domestic constituency, and then taken that example in international cooperation sphere. Maybe it could have, I was struck with this fact that they have gone to more than 100 countries with so far 135,000, and definitely in the recent past, and have gone beyond southern countries, but also in the European countries as well. And finally, the invitation from the WHO and the UNICEF for the manufacturing of vaccines, and then providing those vaccines at an affordable rate, is once again our colleagues, I guess South Center is not here, but they have a program on a similar lines, that how to make use of IPR and how to make use of WTO, those exemptions for generic medicines and manufacturing of affordable medicines. So from my perspective, these are all classical examples of the South-South cooperation, very explicitly coming out from all the case studies. But I would like to ask one or two questions for the presenters. I haven't seen much on what was the impact of individual cases. And as we have discussed, and we are struggling around the issues of defining, and I will not go around accounting, but defining, as we don't define South-South cooperation in a consensual manner, and there are differences whether trade would form part of, and to how much extent the trade components could form part of South-South cooperation. So it may be useful to reflect from the definition side and from the assessment side how these interventions could be assessed based on what we have seen in the morning, the South-South cooperation principles. I thank all the colleagues for this wonderful presentation. Thanks.